My fellow Americans, welcome to the Celluloid President, the podcast about American presidents on film. Today we have a special episode that we're calling the Celluloid Beatles in honor of the 60th anniversary of their invasion of America and the role that film and television played in their success and their influence ever since.
Now, yesterday and today, our theater's been jammed with newspapermen and hundreds of photographers from all over the nation, and these veterans agree with me that the city never has witnessed the excitement stirred by these youngsters from Liverpool who call themselves the Beatles. Now, tonight, you're going to twice be entertained by them. Right now, and again in the second half of our show. Ladies and gentlemen, the Beatles!
I'm Gary Holmes, and joining me today via Zoom from California is Jim Robinson, who just wants to hold your hand. Jim, I'm sitting here in my earth shoes and bell bottoms. Are you wearing your granny glasses and tie-dye t-shirt?
I sure am, Gary. And also, I tried to part my hair down the middle like I used to have it, but it doesn't look the same with just one strand of hair on each side.
Jeez. Yeah. Well,
Those were the
we'll talk
days.
about hair later, I'm sure. This is as I have a bee in my bonnet about the Beatles' hair. Okay, so, well, Jim, as regular listeners know, we usually discuss a film that features a U.S. president. Tell the folks why we are veering from our formula and discussing the Beatles.
Well, I think there are several reasons. First, February 2024 marks the 60th anniversary of the Beatles' first arrival in America. And on February 9th, 1964, was the occasion of their first landmark appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show. Undoubtedly, there's going to be a lot of people who will be talking about this anniversary, and so we wanted to as well. Also, as that Ed Sullivan appearance illustrates, television, video, and films played a huge role in the Beatles' fame and their enduring impact. And besides all that, it's our show, and we want to do it on this topic. So there you have it.
That's the most important reason. You can justify it all you want. The truth is,
Yeah,
we want to do it, and we're doing it.
but let me ask you, Gary, do you remember actually watching that Ed Sullivan Show 60 years ago? If not, when and how did the Beatles first come into your life?
Well, before we answer that, let me first describe the musical world that we grew up in. Elvis had burst on the scene in 1954. That was the year we were born, and there was a huge first wave of rock and roll in the 50s. But Elvis went into the army. Buddy Holly died in a plane crash, and for whatever reason, rock ran out of steam, and youth culture became preoccupied with pop, which had none of the energy and vitality that teenage music should have. If you look at the top 10 songs of 1963, only the number one song, which was Surfing USA by the Beach Boys, makes you want to get up and move. Well, let's look at some of the other ones. You've got Don't They Know It's the End of the World, The Rhythm of the Rain, He's So Fine, Hey Paula, Blue Velvet. I mean, these songs are lovely little songs, but they're not, they're not rock and roll. As for the question of when I first saw them, so when I was a kid, my parents were very social people, and every Saturday night they went out with their friends and left us home with babysitters. And almost every Sunday night, they took the family visiting other families that had kids our age. So on the night in question, we showed up at the home of the Coles family, and they had two daughters. And those girls were so excited about this new group, the Beatles, that I'd never heard of. Those were the days when our Sunday night consisted of The Wonderful World of Disney at 7, Ed Sullivan at 8, and Bonanza at 9. And we watched the Beatles that night, and I became hooked. So, yes, I do remember watching it. And I do remember like falling right into Beatlemania right away. How about you? Do you remember?
Oh, yeah, I remember our family specifically watching the Ed Sullivan Show on February 9th, 1964. And I was enamored with them. I also remember that my mother liked them too. And so my father, I don't remember having an opinion, but my mother was actually a supporter of the music, not talking about the culture and the style. And I thought that was interesting because when history is commonly written now, The arrival of the Beatles and their appearance with all the screaming and Ed Sullivan was supposed to have opened up this huge cultural cleavage. And I'm not so sure that happened until later. I'm sure we'll discuss that. After the appearance on the show, I remember trying to sort of fake outrage my parents by going down to the local store on my own. This was in suburban New York and New Jersey, and buying my very first record, which was the 45 single of She Loves You. And I plopped down my 39 cents or whatever it cost in those days. And I came home and I turned on the record player and I watched out the window for the exact moment that my mother would be pulling up the driveway and entering the house. And I put the needle on the record with the volume up full to the opening bars of She Love You, just as my mother was walking in the house. And my mother said, "Oh no, oh no," but with a smile of bemusement, not with any anger. So that's my first real experience with bringing their music into the house after the Ed Sullivan appearance.
Well, my mother was actually the one who bought me my first Beatles record. That was the Please Please Me LP. And after that, I collected Beatles trading cards, and I was generally all in on Beatlemania. I did actually lose interest for a couple of years because I was too young to be interested in rock music. So fifth, sixth, seventh grade, not so much. But I picked it back up in junior high school, and I fully participated in late stage Beatles, including the Paul is Dead rumors. And I have a clear memory of my 10th grade social studies teacher announcing to the class that the Beatles had broken up, because she'd heard it that day on the radio. And of course, there wouldn't be no other way for us to hear about it. And then even though the Beatles didn't record any more music as a group, my high school years were full of Beatles music because they had a few albums in the can that came out after that. And of course, their solo albums, which were just great. So I remember my childhood being just suffused with the Beatles in the same way that my son's life was filled with Harry Potter, for example.
Yeah, well, my mother, as I said, my mother, who was a musically, trained pianist, so she had more of a normal interest in music than maybe others. When I got my Easter basket on Easter Sunday in 1964, this would be several months after Ed Sullivan, the little present in my Easter basket was the I Want to Hold Your Hand single, in a nice colorful sleeve adorned with pictures of the Fab Four. We did not get into albums in my household until much later when the kids all earned the money to go buy them. We were into singles, we were into 45s. Actually, the first Beatles album I ever owned was not until Magical Mystery Tour, much later. And then I worked backwards. But we had my sister and I had stacks and stacks of 45s from all different artists, led by the Beatles. So my exposure to their music was mainly twofold. It was whatever with the latest single that came out and whatever songs would play over the AM radio. That was my exposure. It wasn't albums.
Can we talk about hair for a second? Because I mentioned that
Yeah.
earlier. So in
You're
1960,
just jealous, Gary.
yeah, I know. Well, hair is was sensitive subject then, and it's still kind of a sensitive subject today. In 1964, when they first burst on the scene, they had actually cleaned up their act from what they'd been in Liverpool. They wore identical suits, they had identical mop top haircuts, but all the adults wanted to talk about was the hair. Instead of saying, "Isn't that cute?" they attacked the guys for being just a little bit different. All I heard about as a kid was how disrespectful they were, and are they girls or are they boys? I didn't think the Beatles were making a statement, but the more the grown-ups made a big deal out of it, the more the boomers who did want to make a statement adopted longer hair as their symbol. And as the decade wore on, they both led and followed the trends that exemplified the full-fledged revolt against conformism.
Yeah, I agree. I agree that they ended up sort of confronting mainstream culture. But I don't think that seriously happened until later in the 60s, when, as you know, the 60s also turned from flower power and peace and love and bright colors and pop art to sort of the grungy drug culture, the revolutionary, nostrums of the day, the protest movement. In the early days, as I was saying, I thought most parents, at least where I grew up, maybe it was different in the Bible Belt, but at least where I grew up, it was more bemusement about the oh, look what these kids are up to now with their rebellion, rather than genuine anger over the cultural splits. Yes, parents in our neighborhood in New Jersey were making fun of the hair and were wanted to be sure that their own kids didn't grow their hair too long, that the heels on the boots weren't too big, that kind of stuff. But it didn't really, at least in my milieu, alarm parents until later on. And in fact, my mother grew to actually hate the Beatles around 68 and 69. She heard Blue Jay Way, the George Harrison droning dark song from Magical History Mystery Tour, heard me playing that one day, and she said, "What is that?" And I said, "Well, that's the Beatles." She goes, "That's just awful. That's the most disgusting thing I ever heard." And she was generally fearful that they would lead me and other teens into the drug culture that they had joined, but not at the beginning.
In the very beginning, they were considered a fad, right? Um, and you're right. The thing about the hair might have been more mocking, but I do believe the fact that they had that hair is what led hair in general to become a symbol, right?
I
Because
agree with that.
because and there's it's hard to say whether they were leading or following the trend, creating the trend, but they had the hair, and then as more people adopted the hair, young people were being criticized for it. I mean, it was just one family battle after another. Did your parents like give you grief about your hair?
No, I mean, I never got too adventuresome with it, and I couldn't grow sideburns or mustaches or beards till later.
Yeah.
So I'll say this: it changed the kinds of haircuts we got. We had buzz cuts, we
Oh
had
yeah.
crew cuts,
Yeah.
and it would have been tremendously uncool to have that in junior high and high school. So I think there's no doubt that hair was a flashpoint of cultural change. All I'm saying is it was relatively safe flashpoint until later. And I think we can forget that the Beatles, I mean, on the Ed Sullivan Show, one of the songs they performed was "Till There Was You" from the show, the totally middle class show, The Music Man,
Yeah.
and they had performed in front of royalty, British royalty, before they ever even arrived in the U.S. They just weren't that big a bunch of revolutionaries until later, is what I'm saying.
Well, I mean, I just want to say one more thing too. When we're talking about, especially when we're talking about movies, how dominant they were for 6 years and how different they were during those 6 years. I mean, they went from those mop top kids to full blown radical hippie looking types, although not completely radical because they were still pretty preoccupied with how much money they were going to make. So
Right,
they didn't
right.
abandon capitalism completely.
But the physical appearance in just 4 or 5 years,
Yeah, it was
all you have to,
amazing.
is unbelievable. And they were powerful trendsetters
Yeah.
through each phase that they embraced and then discarded.
All right. Well, since this is technically a podcast about the presidents, we looked for the intersection of the Beatles and our presidents. Probably the most talked about connection is the theory that one reason for the frenzy over the Beatles in America in the winter of 1964 is that Americans needed something really anything to take their collective minds off that traumatic shock in November 63 when JFK was assassinated. And that was just 6 weeks earlier. Uh, what do you make of this theory?
I think it's possible, but it can't be proven. It's possible that it was a factor. Certainly, it was a pretty grim period, and to the extent that the Beatles were a huge distraction in the way some of the ways we've discussed, and also in the excitement of the young people, I think it's a possible factor in how they caught on in America. But I think what argues against it is the fact that Beatlemania didn't begin in 1964. It began in 1963. Beatlemania was in full force in the UK and in Europe all through 1963, well before JFK was assassinated. And also, I think there was something much more practical driving their timing of their arrival in America, which is mainly that the Beatles had seen other huge stars, pop stars in the UK, strike it really big over there and then come to America and flop, like Cliff Richard, for example. And they were determined not to set foot in America until they actually had a number one record. And when they finally got that number one record at the beginning of 64 with I Want to Hold Your Hand, that's when they agreed to come over. What do you think about the theory?
Yeah, I mean, this is that old causation versus correlation issue. Something happened and then something else happened, and did one cause the other? And as you said, the Beatles they were massive hits over in the UK, and they were a massive hit in the US as soon as that record played. As you know, there's a very convoluted story about how that record made its way over here, and it got played by a DJ and in New York, and it was a huge hit, like spontaneous combustion. I mean, without any promotion or anything, people just loved the music. And I have to say, when I was looking at their appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show, I loved it too. I mean, after all these years, when they started playing, I couldn't believe it. It's like, they're so full of energy. The music is great. And no wonder they became such a big hit. So I hate to say this too, but they were a massive hit among kids. I don't think kids were as upset about JFK as parents were. I mean, I don't remember. I mean, I don't remember being despondent about the state of the country or anything. So they weren't relieving my sorrow.
Yeah, I think those are fair points. One side note about the Ed Sullivan appearance before we leave it is George was very, very sick and almost couldn't go on. He had like 103 temperature that day. He was diagnosed with strep throat, and it was a very iffy proposition as to whether or not he would be able to perform. And if you look at the clips, he still does a very remarkable animated for George kind of performance. He was pumped full of antibiotics and penicillin and vitamin B12 and all that kind of stuff, and just barely made it through the performance. Just a little trivia there.
And I'll just say one other thing about the JFK assassination. I think they still would have been very popular in the United States, but one thing would have been different is that I bet you JFK would have had the presence of mind to have them at the White House, and they wouldn't have been seen as such a countercultural force that they became, And you and I have just talked about this before, that I don't think the 60s would have been so extreme without the JFK assassination. And so the Beatles of the mid 60s probably wouldn't have gone as far out as they had. I think things would have been different for the 60s and also for the Beatles themselves if JFK had lived and had them at the White House.
Yeah, I think that's it. He might have embraced them.
Absolutely.
And in so doing, that might have hurt the Beatles over time because they'd be too establishment.
Well, there wasn't a establishment versus non-establishment thing at that point. I mean,
right.
And that might have helped, by having a younger president who was sort of a little bit in tune with youth culture, there might not have been the massive split that there became later when you had like an old fart like LBJ as president and a bunch of young people who were just rejecting him culturally. Any other presidential relationships with the Beatles? What I know you've been researching this day and night. What else did you find?
There are a few tangents. Of course, during the Nixon administration, John Lennon had turned to totally radical politics for a time. He later said that his politics of that period was bullshit. But that was John. He would always take up new therapies and movements and then discard them. But because of his drug arrest, because of his radical politics, and because of the fact that he was in America only on a visa and not a permanent residence or a green card, the Nixon administration and J.F. Edgar Hoover put him under surveillance and sought to find cause to expel him from the country. So they were quite paranoid about John Lennon, and Nixon administration was. And John Lennon was, as a lot of habitual drug users were, was quite paranoid about being spied upon. And like a lot of paranoid people, they can be paranoid, and at the same time, their paranoia could be correct.
Yeah.
Because later on, there was quite an extensive file of surveillance and wiretapping that had been compiled on John Lennon. So that was one Beatles presidential connection that is pretty well known and that I found.
I can't believe there are two people in the world that were more different than Richard Nixon and John Lennon.
And just to show you the contrast, Gary, of course, there was the famous episode of when Elvis was welcomed right into the White House by Nixon, even carried a firearm with him into the White House, and because he was packing heat. I guess,
there's a whole movie about that, and which I've never seen, but
I haven't either.
We will, before we finish doing this podcast series, we will watch that movie.
Yeah, and so I think the contrast is there. Under President Ford, there was a visit by George Harrison and his band. He was on tour as a solo artist in 74, 75. And so thanks to Gerald Ford's eldest son, George Harrison, Billy Preston with the biggest afro known to mankind, and Ravi Shankar, who were part of the tour, were invited in to visit Gerald Ford in the Oval Office. There's some fun pictures of that with George Harrison sitting side by side with President Ford in front of the fireplace in the Oval. And anyone who's interested should just Google George Harrison, Gerald Ford, and they can see some really fun pictures. I also would note that Paul McCartney was invited during the Obama administration to perform in the White House, and he did so, and including performing the song Michelle for First Lady Michelle Obama. And he was honored at the Kennedy Center with one of those special medals and concerts by President Obama, who sat in the audience with Paul while different performers were covering some of his tunes. So that was another one.
So if Nixon and Lennon were as opposite as you can be, I think Obama and McCartney are pretty close, close sensibilities. And of course, Paul's always been the more establishment Beatle anyway.
Right. There's finally, I leave you with one last presidential connection. On their 1972 album called Sometime in New York City, their poorest selling and most political album, John and Yoko had an album cover that was a facsimile of a newspaper, and each article was the title of one of their songs. And the cover photo of one of the news articles was a fake picture of Richard Nixon and Mao Zedong dancing naked on the album cover. So with that, Gary, I conclude my Beatles presidential connections.
All right. I actually I was confident that you'd be able to get all these, and but I did Google presidents and the Beatles, and I came up with one other additional thing, which is that apparently Lucy Baines Johnson wanted to invite the Beatles to the White House, but LBJ said no way. Um, and then it turned out that the LBJ Museum in Austin did a whole exhibit about the Beatles in America, about 10 years ago. So that shows you how establishment the Beatles have become by now.
Right, and when John and George each passed away, the presidents at the time had all the appropriate
Yeah.
condolences and comments and things to say.
Okay. All right. Well, let's talk about the movie since this is ostensibly a movie podcast. So when we're talking about Beatles movies, we're talking about the films they made and they starred in, but also the movies that reflect on their influence or devise stories and plots around their songs. So, do you have anything more to say about the Beatles movies?
Well, yes, and just before that, I would just note that rock and roll and film were always kind of married together.
Yeah.
You mentioned, I think, Rock Around the Clock was the theme music to Blackboard Jungle, which came out in 1955. Rock Around the Clock was kind of the first official rock and roll song, at least the first official white rock and roll song. And that's the first rock song that John Lennon, it is known, ever heard. In 1956, there was a film called The Girl Can't Help It, which was one of the early, what they called jukebox musicals, which featured songs by Eddie Cochran and Little Richard. And the Beatles saw this film when it came to Liverpool in 56. And they famously tell the story how they were sitting in the audience and they were watching Eddie Cochran and Little Richard perform songs in that movie and have girls chase after them after, and looked at each other, John and Paul, and said, "That's a good job." And that inspired them to want to emulate not only the music, but the lifestyle of getting all the girls they wanted. So that was the precursor. Of course, Elvis went into quite a huge movie career, even as his trend-setting days in rock sort of tapered off. So the Beatles, as soon as they became rock and roll stars, were immediately sought after to make films. And they had a 3-record deal signed in 1964 with United Artists. And the first of those films was A Hard Day's Night, which was sort of a ripped from the headlines take on Beatlemania, came out in 1964. Supposedly, the reason why United Artists wanted to do this was they couldn't have cared less about what the movie was about. They wanted the album, and they got the album. And the first soundtrack album in 1964 was not issued by Capitol Records or by EMI. It was issued by United Artists Records, and it sold like hotcakes. And so that was the impetus for their first film.
Right, right. So to emphasize this, they had signed a deal with who was it, EMI or whatever it was. No, it was Polyphone, right? And the terms weren't good. But if they released a soundtrack, they would have the rights. They would own the rights to the songs that were on the soundtrack. So the soundtrack drove the idea of having the movie.
Exactly.
It'd be a great movie. I mean, A Hard Day's Night is really one of my favorite movies. Whenever I see it, and I've seen it quite a bit, I always love it. It makes me feel happy. The songs are great, and so I think that's a great movie.
Yeah, it really got them going, and it also spawned other bands to get these jukebox musicals as well. So you had, which were very successful and sold records. This drove record sales, much like MTV would later drive record sales in the 1980s. And you had the Herman's Hermits.
I saw that movie.
The Dave Clark Five, Sonny and Cher, the Monkees, and others all do jukebox musicals.
I didn't know the Dave Clark Five did one, but I did go to see.
Oh yeah, I saw that.
Yeah, did you? Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, and then the second movie of their three-picture deal was Help in July of 65. And the third one, after the Beatles had long since lost interest in doing these sort of day in our lives kind of musical excuses for movies, their third movie was Yellow Submarine in 1968, an animated movie. And then they also did a Magical Mystery Tour, a poorly received um, television special movie in 1967. And they did Let It Be in 1970, which showed them in rather grim circumstances recording their what became their Let It Be album. And those were the movies they did while they were still alive and still as a band.
Yeah, and then there are other movies about the Beatles, like Yesterday, in which a struggling musician gets knocked into an alternate universe where no one but him has heard of the Beatles, and he becomes a huge star by passing off their songs as his. Um, and
Right.
and there's many, many documentaries and concert films. You just turn on Prime Video, and there's like a dozen different documentaries about the Beatles.
Yeah, and there's some biopics, there's reenactments of their early days, there's fantasy reenactments of what John and Paul talked about when they met for the last time in the Dakota. And, were they talking about trying to get back together or compose together again?
I've
There's
seen
all
that.
sorts of movies.
Yeah, yeah.
And then the most noteworthy recent one was the Peter Jackson um, nearly 8 hours film that ran on Disney Plus called Get Back, where he used new technology to drastically improve all the footage that had been collected during the 1970 Let It Be filming of the Let It Be movie. And that created a big flurry of interest. And beyond the movies, Gary, there were also the Beatles, in many ways, were the pioneers of music videos because they were big enough and special enough that, unlike other bands, they didn't actually have to show up at one of these variety shows like Ed Sullivan, the Smothers Brothers, David Frost, and other programs, Hullabaloo. They could submit uh, song videos that they made of their latest song in their own, at their own studio or in their own under their own film company, and then just submit them, and they would get run, and that's how they promoted their newer songs.
Well, you mentioned the movie Get Back, and I don't even know if you can call it a movie or a TV show or what, but it was an 8 hour documentary that's filmed in that's presented in three different episodes, and I think that's the greatest movie documentary ever made because it shows you how they made the songs, which is amazing, but it also raises questions about what a documentary actually is because you've got the original director, Michael Lindsay Hogg, made an hour and a half version, and then Peter Jackson then looks at the same video and comes up with an entirely different version with an entirely different story. And in the first one, you see them, you watch it and think, oh God, this is depressing because they're breaking up. And then in the second one, you see they're not really breaking up at all. They just have normal squabbles that people make when they're working on a project together. And then you remember that they made another album after the Let It Be called what is it?
Abbey Road.
Abbey Road, of
Yeah,
course.
the minor inconsequential album of Abbey
Yeah.
Road.
So it's like, what is the truth of? I mean, I feel like I can't really, believe a documentary anymore because you can spin whatever you see to whichever way you want it. So
Well, yes, I think it's wish fulfillment. I love the Get Back movie, um, but I can't help watching it and wondering that this is sort of probably a lot the way we want to remember
right,
the Beatles and not the way it really was. If you look at some of their contemporaneous comments about that period in which they made Let It Be and that first the film footage was actually shot, they are not kind to that period. Um, Now Ringo and Paul, are sort of doing a little revisionist history and saying, well, it really wasn't so bad. We actually had a lot of laughs and all that. But are these just 80-year-old men trying to look back nostalgically? Or are they telling what the truth really was compared to what they said back then? I do think it's bittersweet, that documentary, in many occasions. Of all people, the most sour of the Beatles during that time, George, actually came up with the template as to how they might have gone on forever
Yeah.
when he said to John, why don't we each issue our solo albums whenever we want and come back occasionally for a group album? And John and Yoko both said, that's a good idea. And that's exactly how a lot of bands
Well, that's
have
what the Rolling
survived over
Stones
the
are
years.
like, right?
That's right. How a lot of bands have acted and survived, and yet it never happened.
Well, it
So,
hardly didn't
yeah,
happen. It's because John Lennon got shot. Well, he became a drug addict and then got shot, and who
and there are
knows?
business and legal
And there,
differences.
and right there, yeah. Anyway, so as you can see, we've been talking about a huge body of work, both during Beatlemania and in the 6 decades since. So rather than pick apart each film, we've decided to each pick one movie and briefly describe why we like it and how we judge it. And Jim has actually chosen one of the earlier movies to do a deep dive into. So why don't you tell us about that?
Well, it won't be that deep. I want to be I want to be
Yeah,
brief,
right. I
but
mean, because it's not that deep of a movie.
right. I've chosen Help, and I've got this very guilty confession that I actually prefer Help to Hard Day's Night.
Okay.
I think
What I got to hear?
Hard Day's Night is better artistically, no question. But I happen to be one who loves the Beatles' middle period, who loved the middle period of the 60s. In other words, after the black and white, but before the grunge and hippie grunge drug culture period. I like the swinging London, mod, colorful, bright, mid century modern look and feel of the period. And that's what Help really evokes for me. It's in brilliant colors. The Beatles' pad in central London has all that mid-century modern furniture that my parents bought and outfitted their own house with. And
Well,
I just liked it better. And
so,
here's what the movie,
okay, yeah, okay. So tell us what it's about.
oh, it's this thin plot, so it'll take 2 sentences. Ringo is wearing a ring, one of his many rings, that this very bizarre Indian cult is trying to steal from him because it has some ties to their cult. And so, to chase after that ring, they chase the Beatles all over the world, from London to the Austrian Alps to the Bahamas, even to Buckingham Palace, to try to steal the ring off his finger, or even to cut his finger off to get the ring. And so they chase the Beatles to all these exotic locales, trying to get the ring. And in the course of that, the Beatles perform perfectly framed solos of their latest hits, including the title song, Help. That's what the movie is about.
Yeah, so I have a little bit of fondness for this movie because I think it might be the first movie that my sister and I ever went to by ourselves without our parents. And I also think we liked it so much that we went twice. By this time, I was 11 years old, and I definitely loved the movie. I watched it about 25 years ago and was kind of disappointed that I think it's kind of flaccid. But and before we did this podcast, I tried to watch it again, and it's almost impossible to find. Everything's scrubbed from YouTube. Not even any. There's no scenes. There's no nothing. So I'm just going on 30 or 40-year-old memories here. But I
Yeah.
kind of. I mean, I think it's dull. It kind of jumps from the songs are good, obviously. Although I think I prefer the songs in Hard Day's Night. There are more of them and they're more energetic. And it also goes to show you how bigger budgets and more time doesn't necessarily lead to better art, you know?
Yeah, I think that's true. What it tries to do through its various absurdly comedic pratfalls and situations, it tries to capture the kind of comedy that the Beatles liked. It's a sort of a scenarios that take off on the Goon Show, which was the BBC radio show of the 50s with Peter Sellers. They loved Peter Sellers and that style of comedy. And it tries to capture the James Bond craze. There's some of the chase scenes that echo that. And interestingly enough, it's the first exposure during the making of the film that the Beatles and George Harrison in particular had to Indian music. It's where George became interested in the sitar. And it would only be months later when he would first use the sitar in Norwegian Wood during the making of Rubber Soul. So I think it's got its significance. It's also interesting that based on reviews of the acting in Hard Day's Night, where Ringo was dubbed the best of the actor of the Beatles, that they decided to make Ringo the center of the plot. He was also the goofiest one and the most easiest one to put in absurd situations. So they made him the center of the plot.
Well, there's another reason for that too,
Yeah,
which
yeah.
is, if it wasn't Ringo, George and Paul were they would have been at each other's throats over who was going to be the lead, right? So,
Well, I was going to say that it's interesting that when I watched this film, Ringo and John had the most lines and the most scenes, and Paul and George were kind of afterthoughts. Paul didn't even have a solo vocal until halfway through the movie with The Night Before. And it was John with the solos. And one final fun fact I note on the movie, if you go to IMDb and you look up the cast and you look up John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, Ringo Starr, behind each of their names, it says uncredited. And they were indeed uncredited.
oh, so the names aren't in well, I guess you don't need their names because they're collectively the Beatles.
So huge that you can be uncredited.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to dump on a Beatles movie because having them in it, I understand that they were they were very bored making this movie because they were standing around all the time. Yeah, because when you make a movie, you stand around a lot of time while they're bringing in lights and stuff like that.
Well, they also said they were stoned on marijuana the entire film, and they didn't like it.
I just don't like the humor, I mean, it's like this the clowning around and the zaniness and it's just not. I mean, I know that's very popular 60s humor. It's just not my cup of tea. And of course, the Monkees obviously I mean, it's a ripoff of Help. I mean, the Monkees show was basically Help in 30-minute episodes for 3 years. But I just want to mention one more thing. First of all, this was a hit. I mean, it was a hit. I mean, totally a hit. Not the top hit of the year, but it was in the top 20 or so. And you've already mentioned James Bond. And when I looked at the list of the top movies, the British influence is really crazy. There were 2 James Bond movies in the top 10, and the biggest star of 1965 was Julie Andrews, right? Between The Sound of Music and Mary Poppins, I mean, the Brits were all over our culture by 1965.
Right, and I think there was kind of a stylistic that said that once you go into color, from black and white to color, you're almost supposed to be less serious.
Yeah.
So if you think about some of the shows, the first year of The Man from U.N.C.L.E. was in black and white. The second year was in color at the precise moment those plots became more zany. And the same thing happened in Lost in Space and other shows and movies of the time. The James Bond films became more madcap and parody and zany. So I think it was just a style of the time. Both Hard Day's Night and Help had the same director, Dick Lester, who the Beatles really liked. They both made money, although Help cost more to make. So the profits were not quite as great with Help compared to Hard Day's Night.
All right. Well, my movie is from 2007. It's called Across the Universe. This tells the story of the 60s through Beatles songs. The Beatles are not in it. The protagonist is a working class Liverpool lad who comes to America to find his father, a former soldier who'd impregnated his mother during World War II and is now a janitor at Princeton. After meeting Dad, he becomes best friends with a rebellious preppy and then is pulled into the vortex of the counterculture in New York City and falls in love with his best friend's sister. We see how anti-war protests turn nihilistic and violent. As I said, the Beatles are never mentioned; they're only implied. But all the main characters have names from Beatles songs. There's Jude is the main character, Max is his friend, Lucy, Prudence, Sadie, Jojo. The movie ends with a concert on a Greenwich Village rooftop that looks exactly like the roof in London where the Beatles had their Get Back mini concert. And after all the violence and despair, the characters reconcile into sadder but wiser, more mature relationships. So this was directed by Julie Taymor, one of the most successful Broadway choreographers, famous for The Lion King. So the musical numbers are amazing, and they advance the plot and our understanding of cultural trends. I love it. I watched it again. I loved it when I saw it, and I watched it again last week. And it's hard to capture what the '60s are like because the fashions, language, and attitudes of the counterculture were so extreme. But I think Julie Taymor did a better job than many movies that were even made at the time. The movie makes it clear that in the '60s, the vast majority of the population was still square with short hair, jobs, monogamy, but also that the counterculture was not just one thing, but many things, usually boiled down to sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And you see all this in the movie. The sexual freedom represents a rejection of discipline, order, careerism, and the drugs mean a spiritual quest that goes beyond traditional religion. And the rock and roll represented a new individualist, innovative culture in music, art, cinema, and theater. And you see all that at play in the movie. So, I like the movie. I think I like the movie because it just reminds me so much of the '60s. I feel like I'm seeing, my mid-teens playing out right there.
Well, I've seen the movie and I really like it. In fact, I own it on DVD. I have to say that I'm normally reticent about movies that try to strain to create plots around the Beatles songs. And have you ever seen the Cirque du Soleil
Mhm.
Love production?
In Las Vegas.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I did too. And I loved the music and the sound system, in the theater where I saw was fantastic. But I thought after a while it tried to infuse too much social and political relevance and philosophy into this or that Beatles trifle of a tune. And I thought there was a little bit of that in this movie in terms of building the plot. But I have to say, I thought the three lead characters were fantastic and full of charm, and they performed the songs themselves
Yeah.
and did a great job. And that's not easy to do with some of these vocals. So I thought they were really good. When I watched the movie, I don't think I could sit through the whole movie again. But what I like to do, and they're all on YouTube, is watch them as individual music videos. That's what I enjoy.
Okay.
And but I don't particularly like sitting down from start to finish to watch it as a movie. I imagine that a nice chunk of their budget went to being licensing the rights to the songs. Did you ever come across
I didn't
what
come
they had to
across
pay?
that. and it occurred to me when I was watching it, there are 30 different songs in that movie, and I think they must have given them a deal or something. They must have really been taken with Julie Taymor's vision and given them a cut. When they made that movie yesterday about the guy who goes into an alternate universe where the Beatles aren't. They licensed them for they could only afford like 10 songs, so they had to pick carefully what songs they were. So I don't know what they paid for it.
But
Uh,
did they play the actual? It costs more when you play the actual Beatles records than it
right,
does when you cover a song.
right, exactly. No, in yesterday, it's just this good guy playing the guitar, the singing yesterday, for
Oh,
example.
so they didn't
Oh, they
play
didn't
the
play the
actual
actual
Beatles
songs, no. So
like
I
Mad
think
Men did at
like
times.
Mad Men did, yeah. You know what one thing I like about the movie is that it's political without being overtly political. To the extent there's a villain, it's the radical activist who's the head of the New York version of what they call of the SDS. He promotes violence and ends up accidentally blowing himself up in a Greenwich Village townhouse with a homemade bomb, which is something that actually did happen back then. The Beatles themselves were nonviolent peaceniks, and they definitely were not trying to upend society. Anyone who spent as much time trying to acquire and hold on to their wealth as they did were not revolutionaries.
Yeah,
Uh,
I think the message is relatively tame. I mean, you have the one of the penultimate scenes where the lead character goes in and sings John's Revolution,
mhm.
which talked, against violence, and you shouldn't go around carrying pictures of Chairman Mao and all that, and where he's confronting the radicals in the townhouse. So you have scenes like that, but then they're paired with scenes that are undeniably tragic, like when the lead girl's fiance is killed in Vietnam, or brother, I guess, is killed in Vietnam, and so you've got that too. And so I think it's good in that respect. I think it drags on a little too long. The whole scene of the acid trip and the Ken Kesey style bus where they're singing, I guess, because and I am the walrus and all that is it just goes on a little too long for my taste. But
Yeah, well,
I would recommend it to anybody that's into the Beatles.
yeah, and I would recommend to anyone who's interested in social history too. One anyone who really wants to see what it was in the 60s. It's hard to, as I said, it's hard to capture that. Mad Men tried really hard, and they didn't, I, they didn't quite get it, and I don't think they had the budget to get it. But it really feels like I'm looking at people that I knew back then.
Well, Paul and Ringo really liked it.
Okay.
So that's if that endorsement means anything to you, in fact Julie Trainer is it screened it with
Taymor, Julie
Tamor
Taymor.
screened it with Paul and before release and said, "Now, Paul, is there anything you don't like?" And he sort of teary-eyed said, "What's there not to like?"
Yeah. Well, I found it very emotional. And the characters are not that finely drawn. They're actually archetypes. And but I did still feel like they managed to make us emotionally involved with them. And so it was, and you see I mean, the movie begins in the early Beatles at a prom, like old-fashioned sock hop, like that you would see in the 50s.
And
And
a bowling alley and
bowling, yeah, and all of a sudden
well,
it ends with a demonstration in at Columbia where they're occupying the college and getting beaten up, and I mean it's horrifying what happens at the end. And then another brother comes back from Vietnam, and he's a
drug
mess.
addict. Yeah.
Yeah, he's just he's got PTSD, although we didn't recognize it back then.
Good movie. It does show the full sweep of the 60s.
All right. Before we wrap this up, let's do something that we don't usually do, and see if we can tick off or annoy our audience. We're going to do this by each of us are going to talk about who our favorite Beatle is. This is an ongoing, age-old debate from the minute the Beatles came on stage, and each of us have our favorite Beatle. You and I have talked about this forever. So why don't you take the plunge first and explain who your favorite Beatle is and try and justify it?
Well, the problem with doing this, Gary, is that to to elevate one Beatle, it always ends up sounding like you're criticizing the other Beatles,
Yeah.
when in fact most Beatles fans love all the Beatles. And I do. I love all the Beatles. I think Paul is undoubtedly the best musician in the band and has the most innate musical talent. I think John was one of those Hemingway slash JFK characters who, tormented as he was the most charismatic, the natural leader, and probably had the highest IQ. He wasn't that well schooled, but he was an absolute voracious reader of all the Churchill volumes, of the Churchill's books and all that. Ringo was perfect for the American teen audience. In fact, polls constantly showed, as did mountains of fan mail, that in America, Ringo was easily the most popular Beatle, which probably says something about America. My favorite Beatle has always been and is to this very day George Harrison. And I think it's because that he was kind of the underdog, he was kind of the loner, he was a little bit diffident, he was not as glib as the others. He struck me as being a little more thoughtful, and I liked the tone of a lot of his songs because they sort of fit my personality. Songs like Don't Bother Me, songs like If I Needed Someone, if you want to get a call from me, you better carve your number on my wall, and then maybe I'll call. That sort of, I hate to say it, fits my personality a little bit.
Well, what
So I
about
go
Taxman?
and Taxman, and then his later songs where he became really quite adept as a songwriter. So I've got to go with the ornery contrarian, just like me, George Harrison. How about you, Gary?
Well, first of all, I have to say you surprised me because I thought for sure you were going to say John Lennon. You probably have grown over the years, because I'm positive that when we were in college, you were a John guy. But
I don't remember that, but
no, okay.
don't get me started on my number two, because then you'll really, any Paul or Ringo fan really going to get mad.
Well, to be honest with you, I have Paul written all over me. He's the most bourgeois, the most grounded, the hardest working. These are virtues that I really admire. And they're really on display during that documentary, Get Back, when it's clear that he's the one driving the rest of the group to make the album. Half the time, John comes into the recording studio stoned or indifferent to what's going on. You never know that he and Paul were supposed to be equals. I get the sense that Paul was more grounded because he had a happy and secure home growing up, unlike John, who was rejected by both parents and had a lot to rebel against. But in addition to the personality, I kind of just like Paul's music better. It shows more range. I mean, everything from back in the USSR to the long and winding road. I mean, these are not deep songs. I recognize that George actually does write more searchingly deep songs, and I do like George a lot too. I think the best single album or the best solo album is All Things Must Pass. I have a very, very feel a very heavy connection to that record. So anyway,
Well, you want to hear something
Paul's my
really,
guy.
but yeah, I somehow I could have predicted that, but here's an oddity. My favorite solo album is a Paul album.
Okay.
It's the very first homegrown, almost like outtakes
Yeah.
album called McCartney.
Yeah,
And
I
it's
like that
mainly,
album. Yeah.
yeah, it's mainly because of the vibe in it, not because of the polish or the heaviness of the songs. I just love that album. And, but I have to say one thing about the solo work. I love a lot of the solo Beatle albums, but I can never love their solo work as much as I love their group work. If for no other reason, one of the things that was so distinctive for me about the Beatles was the way their three of their voices blended together. Each voice had its own texture, even George's. And on some of the harmony, three-part harmony work, or a song like Help, where Paul and George sing contrapuntal vocals in the background as John is singing the verses, to me, that's what makes the Beatles' work so magical. And most of the solo work, while some of it had harmonies and background singing, none of them emphasized background singing like the group records did.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. I mean, I think the Beatles as a group collectively are better than the Beatles individually. And you can see this, you can see why this is so if you watch that Get Back documentary, because, one of them comes in with a song or idea for a song, and they just work, all four of them are kind of working it together, and they're throwing in riffs and they're throwing in guitar and they're so it's, even though we all say, oh, that's a John song, that's a Paul song, that's a George song, they work collectively to make them better. So
Yeah, I thought, there's that famous scene where Paul is on the spot inventing Get Back
right.
on his bass. And I'm going to believe that he didn't already have that song scrap in his songbook at home, because I want to believe that, like everyone else who loves that scene, I want to believe that he just made it up with
Well, I
spontaneity.
kind of think
But
that he did.
we don't really know that, but I don't care. I
Yeah.
want to believe it. But if you look at that whole scene, it's almost like John wasn't there yet that day. It's almost like George should have deserved a co-writing credit, the way he really fleshed out the melody line for with Paul. But I'll say one other thing about George and about movies. A few years ago, Martin Scorsese did a 3 hour long biopic of George
Yeah. Yep.
called
I
Living
love
in the
that. Yep.
Material World.
Yep.
And I
Yep.
would really recommend that to any Beatles fan, because it's a lot about the Beatles too. And maybe, just maybe, it will flip a few fans to the George fandom that I'm in. But it's really a
Yeah.
good movie.
Well, and similarly, another fantastic movie about George is Concert for George.
Oh,
Um,
yes.
that where after he died, they put together his friends played his music for 3 hours, and it's fantastic. I mean, I love it. Paul's there and all, but also his other close friends, Eric Clapton, and you know,
Bob Dylan.
yeah.
Yeah.
And thirdly, while we're at it, the other thing that George gets credit for is inventing the fundraising, the fundraising concert, like the concert for Bangladesh. I guess that's a movie. I've never actually seen that.
Yes. They turned it into a movie.
Yeah, I don't know why I've never seen that. I should probably look that up. But
And the other thing,
yeah.
yeah, and John and Yoko, or Yoko, especially after John died, put out a few films. There's The Making of Imagine, was put out as a movie. It's kind of a vanity project, but it's still very interesting.
I saw
And
that too. Yeah.
yeah, and then unfortunately for Paul, he made Give My Regards to Broad Street, which he tried to make a plot-oriented movie with him as the star. And it was a huge bomb and ridiculed to this day. And so Paul, I think, is lucky that Get Back by Peter Jackson really can stand as the definitive Paul post-breakup movie because it's really good. It puts Paul in a great light. I agree with that.
Yeah, no, I mean, again, I do like George a lot. Paul just, I mean, the Beatles wouldn't be the Beatles without Paul.
Oh, right, right.
I mean, they
I
wouldn't be
do
without
think,
John Lennon either. I get it, but he's the one that pushed them on. And I just love, I mean, those songs appeal to me.
yeah, yeah.
All right. Well, we've talked about this a lot over the years. So let's call it a day. I just want to remind everyone that our podcast is still available on Apple, Spotify, Amazon, and most podcast platforms. You can subscribe there. Next time, we're going to go back to our old familiar ground for the celluloid president. We're going to discuss 2023's blockbuster Oppenheimer, which will no doubt figure heavily in the upcoming Oscars. I mean, it's already won Golden Globe, so I'm sure it's heavily favored to win the Oscar. There is actually a portrayal of a U.S. president in that film, a very brief appearance by Harry Truman. And we have some things to say about Harry Truman, I'm sure. And because of the film's timeliness and importance and Truman's very consequential presidency, we think it'll be a good choice. And I'm sure you'll enjoy the discussion. So any last words, Jim?
No, I'll try really hard, but I don't think we're going to find a Beatles connection with Harry Truman. They were all alive, though. They were
Well, he
all
was
alive.
alive. He didn't die till 1969, so he lived throughout the entire length of the Beatles.
Actually, I will Google whether Harry Truman ever made a comment about the Beatles.
Oh, I'm sure he did, right? I'm sure he said something extremely snide because if you go back to 60s culture, you'll always find someone dissing the Beatles. All right. All right. Well, we'll see you next time, Jim.
Cheerio.
All right. Cheerio. Bye bye.
As a stranger to our shores, the least I can do is offer you some Ivy League hospitality. This is Jude. This is my sister. My God, you have perfect teeth. What are you gonna do if you don't go back to college? What any irresponsible, unmotivated dropout would do? Go to New York, like tonight.